Thank you all so much for joining today. Welcome to PHA's Connect Drug Discovery from the Lab to Consumer Virtual Town Hall. We are really glad that you are here to join us for this event. I'm Elizabeth Josloff. I'm the Vice President of Quality Care and Research at PHA, and it is my pleasure to host today's event. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker to share his expertise and knowledge about the drug discovery and development process. Dr. Roham Zamanian is an associate professor of pulmonary and critical care medicine and the director of pulmonary hypertension service at Stanford University Medical Center. Dr. Zamanian, thank you so much for being here today.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this program. So I guess what we're going to do today, and I would like to talk to you about, is a broad perspective of what drug discovery and development is. As you may know, drug discovery and development is really the process for evaluating, discovering, and testing new therapies from the bench or the laboratory to you, the patients, and the community. A drug could be any chemical entity, or it could be a biological substance, and it can be used in a variety of ways: diagnosing, preventing disease, or really treating disease. And that's what often people think about when they think about drug development. It's the process is an important pathway and a contributor to health and wellness for not only patients, but also for bringing effective and safe therapeutics and building upon those in the past. And what I'd like you to consider is that you, the patients, are not only our priority, but also a major stakeholder in this process. The other stakeholders you hear from: physicians like myself, clinical scientists and bench researchers, our pharmaceutical colleagues, and obviously the regulators, the US Federal Drug Administration, and also other entities like the European medical agencies. So the process is complex and time-consuming and very costly, but I'd like to give you an insight into what this process looks like so that you could better understand what all the other stakeholders are working and how they do to bring therapies to you, the patients that we care all about and entirely focused on. Not only is the length of drug development and pipeline from the initial discovery to market or to consumers to patients a very, very long time, as you're beginning to recognize, on average about 14 years, sometimes even longer. There is also a process by which the chemical entities or the biological substances go through. The initial phase, which takes about 6 to 7 years, is the combination of drug discovery, starting with thousands, maybe tens of thousands of compounds, and testing in preclinical setting. A preclinical setting means in animals and tissue culture in the laboratory, to not only demonstrate the viability of giving that drug in a safe and tolerable manner to animals or in tissue, but also to show that there is an effect on the relevant pathways, mechanisms that we care about. In pulmonary hypertension, do they affect BMPR signaling? Do they affect the pulmonary arteries, the heart, etc.? That preclinical process begins to focus the tens of thousands of compounds into maybe a couple of hundred. And in the next phase, people begin to look at the clinical implementation and clinical testing of those compounds. Those usually start with early testing to make sure it's safe and tolerable, and they continue on to go to later phase clinical development, looking at the safety, tolerability, but also the efficacy of these compounds. And that usually takes also yet another 6 to 10 years. And then once you have a compound, you begin to have those conversations. Sometimes you have those conversations already with the regulatory agencies to make sure that you're testing the right set of patients, make sure that the regulatory agencies agree with the design of the studies, and that basically one compound is then reviewed and analyzed by the regulatory agencies, but also by other entities, the other clinicians, experts in the field, and finally may come to market. So the pathway is not only long, but it's highly competitive, and there is a huge attrition of the number of compounds. So you can imagine how much time, financial investment, and effort that goes into just developing one therapy. In PAH, we've been so fortunate to have colleagues that you've already heard from that invest time and effort. Now we have more than 10 therapeutics, 13, 14 therapeutics, maybe some coming in the future that has been developed in the last 2 decades. So we're incredibly fortunate as a respiratory group to have so many therapies come to market, and we hope that that is the same in the future. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So drug discovery begins in the laboratory, where the scientists identify the substance. They apply the scientific rigor and the knowledge that they have about the disease to identify targets that are important in the disease pathway. Scientists often focus on a biological pathway, and then think about whether there are new therapies or even existing therapies that could be applied to that pathway. More and more in PAH, we're beginning to recognize that we need to not only develop drugs from a mechanistic perspective, from a biological pathway perspective, and take it to the patients, but also learn from those previous failures and take it back to the laboratory and test and see how we can improve upon those targets. Next slide. So basically, many substances are tested in experimental scenarios. Some targets that, such as ones that we have done and my colleagues here at Stanford have done, go through a high throughput screening, meaning you take thousands of drugs and look at how they perform in a mechanism of interest. And when they're evaluated, then you do experiments to confirm the activity of those drugs and the tolerability of those drugs. Sometimes what you may need to do is modify chemical structures, optimize dosing. This is something that is already beginning to be evaluated in the laboratory to reduce this possible side effects, but also to encourage target engagement, meaning whether those drugs are affecting the kinds of cells, the structures, maybe the receptors that are representative of what you're trying to affect. Before testing a drug in patients, researchers need to make sure that they understand it well enough so that it will be safe, tolerable, and work to their desire in terms of when they bring that to the patient. So the preclinical drug candidates must have potential benefits and mechanisms of action. They'll do something on the blood cells or the pulmonary artery cells. They need to have a tolerable side effect and adverse event profile. You don't want a drug that is a blockbuster in terms of treating the disease, but can cause a malignancy or something that is also another chronic illness. You want to understand how to administer the drug and what doses to give that drug in. That's really, really key. And you need to understand whether the chemical structures of your medications allow you to administer the medication orally to patients. Should they be inhaled or should they be intravenously administered? And then once you have a little bit of that. One of the other things in terms of the preclinical and the translation from the animal to human studies is you want to understand how those drugs are absorbed and metabolized and distributed in the body. It isn't that a medication is taken in, it works for a little bit and it's gone. Some medications can actually have a large volume of distribution, meaning they can go into the fat cells of the body and remain there for sometimes days, sometimes years. And you need to understand that there is a pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies. These are studies with pharmacology experts to understand the behavior of those drugs. And then also you need to understand, the effects of the drug on specific patient populations. We're beginning to realize that there are differences, gender differences and race and ethnicity differences in the way that drugs are metabolized even, and their effects. So all of this come into the assessment, the preclinical assessment of drug candidates and are a key step into going from the bench to the clinics. Next slide. So then we begin the idea of human clinical trials. There are major questions that we need to address in clinical trials. Is the drug safe in patients? Is the drug obviously effective? What is the best method of delivery of those drugs to patients? And not only is it the right dose, but how can a patient tolerate that regimen? Is it really realistic to think a patient will take 15 tablets 5 times a day? That would be really hard, even for the some of us who don't have tremendously busy and complicated lives. And how does the drug compare to the current standard of care? This is a big question in pulmonary hypertension because of the success that all the investigators have had in developing therapeutics. Now it becomes a little bit more difficult, even challenging, for us to demonstrate effectiveness because the standard of care, the bar is so high. And obviously we always want to know which patients benefit the most. A drug that is approved for an indication is approved because there is a spectrum of response. And that group of cohort of patients, they have a median response or an average response. But that doesn't mean every patient will respond that precisely. Some patients will benefit a lot more from the medication and some a little bit less. That's what we're trying to figure out. Clinical studies and clinical testing follow a traditional set of development processes. This is based on scientific mandate and the scientific principles of doing no harm first and optimizing the effectiveness. So it isn't magic that we see a chemical in the laboratory and then sprinkle it on to our patients. That's very, very rare when you hear about these extremely rare compassionate situations. The translation from basic to clinics is through these phase processes. Phase 1 studies are typically first in man studies or first in a group of patients, and typically first drug tested in a small group of healthy volunteers, 15, 20, 30 patients, healthy volunteers who go under rigorous testing. They get the medication depending on the design of the phase 1 every day. Sometimes they need to stay in the clinical trial unit to be tested multiple times. They have blood drawn at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes to understand the profile of those medications. So we test the safety and tolerability of those medications in healthy volunteers. Sometimes phase 1 can happen in disease patients, like pulmonary hypertension. But those phase 1 studies are not to develop a sense of effectiveness of the drug. It's more about the safety and tolerability. That's a mandate. We don't want a highly toxic drug going into patients, not only healthy volunteers, but also diseased patients. Phase 2 studies are typically the new drug that's given to a group of patients, and it's typically into patients of the disease that is being studied. These studies test further safety, because you could imagine if you have pulmonary hypertension with some liver dysfunction, that drug may act differently in you than it does in a healthy subject who has a normal kidney or liver function. And so you look at a further safety and tolerability profile. And sometimes people call phase 2 studies proof of concept studies. We're trying to see, is there a signal of efficacy? And in rare diseases, this is an important step for stakeholders who invest time and effort, and even investigators who conduct clinical trials with the support of the NIH, for example. So this is proof of concept. When we get to phase 3 studies, these studies are formal studies typically. They're often viewed as approval studies. And they seek to interact with the regulators to demonstrate to them that this drug is actually effective. And it typically compares the standard of care on top of their drug versus just the standard of care alone. Fairly traditional design, but there are other designs as well. These studies are larger. In pulmonary hypertension, depending on the goal that you're trying to achieve, the primary endpoint of these clinical trials, the number of patients that we need to study historically is between 250 to about even 12 or 1,300 patients, which is very difficult in a rare disease. To just draw a contrast for you, blood pressure medications, systemic hypertension, regular blood pressure, high blood pressure, or coronary artery disease. These trials are thousands of patients. It's not a rare disease, so that they are required to test in thousands and thousands of patients. And because they can test in thousands of patients, the number of the incremental improvement that they make on standard of care could be smaller and smaller. The problem we have in pulmonary hypertension is because of the rarity of your disease, we have to be thinking outside the box on how to do better phase 3 studies so that we can show the incremental improvement that some of these medications have. Next slide. So what does it mean to have a drug approved? The Federal Drug Administration, the Food and Drug Administration, I always call it federal, in the United States is the regulator of controlling results from the clinical trials and confirming and providing approval to these drugs that responds to the efficacy and also safety. In other continents, it's other agencies, the European medical agencies, the Japanese regulatory agencies. Each continent or each country typically has their own regulatory agencies. Then once the FDA approves the drug, that's when it will be available to the patients. Sometimes the FDA will mandate a post-marketing study or a phase 4 study. And these are real-world scenarios. If I give drug X to 1,000 patients, you need to monitor those 1,000 patients because we're worried about the liver or the kidney. Or we need to look at what the impact it is on outcomes. Typically, this is a conversation between the regulators and the sponsors of these medications. Our pharmaceutical colleagues are very well aware of these post-marketing studies. You as patients may have the opportunity to join a phase 2 clinical trial, proof of concept study. If you're my patient, you know you have. Phase 3 larger studies, or even sometimes phase 4 registry studies. And those are typically available at most of the comprehensive and regional care centers that participate in your care. Next slide. So I have to say, we are here to help you, and I've been in the field for about 17 years, and the participation by our patients, you are the stakeholders that you will actually provide us the most effort, but you'll also hopefully reap the benefit of those efforts. So your involvement in drug discovery and development is instrumental. My own feeling is that me as a clinician and a scientist, my responsibility is to make sure that I take care of you, that we take care of you the best that we can, and we keep researching, we keep building upon. I also think that my patients, and I tell sometimes them, that you have a responsibility to also consider, you don't have to do anything that you don't want, but consider participation in clinical trials, because the medications that you're taking currently, you're standing on shoulders of patients who were in clinical trials previously. So you can talk to your healthcare provider about a clinical trial. If your healthcare provider doesn't know about a clinical trial, be informed and ask them who you can reach out to. Our colleagues at the PHA have a website for you to find clinical trials. And you could actually search it. I searched it the other day within a certain area of that I'm willing to travel. And it will tell you what clinical trials there are. And there are other resources through the PHA classrooms as well. Ask your PH care provider and at least consider participating in a registry that the PHA is sponsoring called the FAR registry. It is already telling us a lot, and there are many centers that are participating in FAR. We do it for free as physicians, and we put our coordinators into it, and all we ask is we collect your information and you fill out a questionnaire. And believe it or not, there are already about 3 publications from this effort, and kudos to the PHA for doing that. The family members and caregivers, you guys could always participate as well. Healthy volunteers are definitely needed for clinical trials, but also patients with mutations like a BMPR2 mutation. We need to know if the family members are also carriers of that mutation, and if they are, we learn from those patients who are healthy with the mutation, what is it about them that the disease hasn't started in? So I think this is a situation where please help us help you is the message. And I really think that all of us as a community, especially a rare disease community, have responsibilities to each other. So just to review, the development of drugs from their discovery to use is a long, long investment of time, effort, and finances. Time and effort and finances on everyone's shoulders, the physicians, the pharmaceutical companies, the regulators, and you, of course, the patients who have to travel to be part of these clinical trials. It's complex and it's time consuming and it's expensive, but you see what we've done in the last 2 decades. The goal of it is to bring new treatments that are safe and effective. And what means effective now is probably different than the definition of effective 20 years ago when the first of the series of medications, epoprostenol, came onto the market. Thankfully, with the collaboration with patients, our pharmaceutical colleagues, our scientists, we're discovering more and more about this awful, awful rare disease and other diseases as well. And I think we're accelerating what it means to bring drugs to the market. And you'll hear about new therapeutics in PAH that have different mechanisms of action, maybe affect the genetics of the disease and affect heart function and blood vessels as well, but in a chronic manner. So I think that's my last slide, Elizabeth, if I'm not wrong. Thank you very much for the opportunity for me to get on my soapbox and give you a little bit of my perspective. And, you know, obviously I'm glad to answer any questions.
And again, one more time, I'd like to thank Dr. Roham Zamanian for a very informative and engaging presentation.